History is not just a record of events. It's a narrative. And like all narratives, it can be shaped, manipulated, and rewritten, often by those who hold power. While we're taught to believe in the objectivity of textbooks, the truth is much darker. History is frequently written by the victors. And in their triumph, they bury the uncomfortable truths that mar the legacies they seek to preserve. Today, we're uncovering 5 forgotten or deliberately erased massacres. Horrors pushed to the margins of history because they don't align with the dominant storylines. These are chapters in human history we must never forget. Number 1, the Tasmanian Genocide, the extermination of indigenous Tasmanians. Our first stop takes us to Van Diemen's Land, known today as Tasmania, where an entire people, indigenous Tasmanians, were systematically wiped out in one of history's most brutal yet scarcely acknowledged genocides. During the early 19th century, British settlers claimed Tasmania as their own, an act that would lead to the Black War of 1824 to 1831. Though termed a war, it was no battlefield conflict. It was a campaign of extermination. Indigenous Tasmanians were hunted, their families slaughtered, their homes destroyed. Survivors faced forced removal and displacement to desolate areas far from their ancestral lands. Disease, starvation, and violence did the rest of the work. By the 1830s, their population, once estimated at several thousand, had dwindled to near extinction. Often omitted in British historical accounts, these atrocities were sanitized, downplayed as the inevitable side effects of settlement. But in truth, this was organized genocide, an entire culture wiped out in the name of empire building. Number 2, the Philippine-American War massacres, a colonial bloodbath buried by time. Next, we travel to Southeast Asia and the Philippines, where a brutal war of colonial conquest unfolded from 1899 to 1902 under America's watchful eye. After defeating Spain in the Spanish-American War, the U.S. took control of the Philippines. But Filipino fighters seeking independence had other plans. Their resistance was met with shocking violence. Entire villages were set ablaze. Civilians, men, women, and children, were executed en masse under the guise of pacifying the population. One of the most chilling atrocities was the Balangiga Massacre in 1901. Retaliating for a guerrilla attack, U.S. forces destroyed an entire region. Thousands of civilians were not only slaughtered, but targeted as a matter of policy, with specific orders to kill anyone over the age of 10 suspected of aiding the resistance. Yet, even as these horrors unfolded, the American narrative obscured the truth, framing the war as a civilizing mission. The real story of what the Philippines endured remains overshadowed by the broader triumphs of U.S. expansionism at the turn of the century. Number 3, the Suk Ching Massacre, Singapore's forgotten atrocity. Our story moves to World War II and Japanese-occupied Singapore, a time and place rife with tension and fear. In February 1942, Japanese forces launched the Suk Ching Massacre, targeting the ethnic Chinese communities of Singapore. Why? They suspected these civilians held anti-Japanese sentiments or supported resistance movements. Men and boys aged 18 to 50 were rounded up in mass screenings, many taken to desolate locations under false pretenses. What followed was systematic slaughter, an execution of thousands, often by firing squads. Official estimates range from 5,000 to a harrowing 50,000 victims, though incomplete records have kept the full truth hidden. Why isn't this event given its rightful place in history books? Some blame post-war priorities, as Allied forces sought to rebuild and shift attention toward Cold War concerns. The massacre, horrific as it was, became a mere shadow in Singapore's and the world's wartime narrative. Number 4, the Red Terror in Ethiopia, communist-era killings and the silence of Cold War politics. Mengistu Haile Mariam, Ethiopia's leader at the time, oversaw the imprisonment, torture, and execution of tens of thousands of Ethiopians. Dissidents, journalists, and even the vaguely disloyal were eliminated en masse. Their bodies, often dumped in rivers or buried in unmarked graves. But why is this chapter of Ethiopian history so overlooked? The answer lies in geopolitics. The Cold War rendered human rights a secondary concern, as Western nations saw Ethiopia as a useful counter to Soviet influence in the Horn of Africa. A regime of terror unfolded unchecked, its survivors and victims largely forgotten outside Ethiopia's borders. Number 5, the Koçgiri Massacre, a suppressed Kurdish tragedy. Our final story takes us to Turkey in 1921, where the cries of a people demanding autonomy were silenced through unspeakable violence. The Kurdish Alevi population of Koçgiri staged a rebellion, seeking rights and freedoms in the newly forming Turkish Republic. The response brutal. The Turkish military crushed the rebellion with sweeping savagery. Villages were razed, entire families executed, and countless others displaced. The official erasure of these events from Turkish history was swift and thorough. Even today, discussion of the Koçgiri massacre remains taboo in Turkey, suppressed in the name of nationalist pride. But the survivors' stories persist, fragments of an erased memory demanding acknowledgement. History isn't merely a collection of dates and events. It's a living story of humanity. And yet so much of that story lies buried. These massacres, the Tasmanian genocide, the Philippine-American War atrocities, the Sukching massacre, the Red Terror, and the Koçgiri massacre, aren't isolated. They're part of a pattern. When the truth threatens the power of those who shape history, it's erased. But we must remember, because to forget such horrors is to risk repeating them. So ask yourself, what else has been erased? What truths are still hidden? History's full story remains incomplete until we uncover the buried chapters. No voice. Shot transitions to end the chapter.